June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Dawn breaks over an endless mirror of water. Thin mist drifts above the waves, soft as smoke. Aboard Japan's flagship Taya, officers peer east. Straining through binoculars, the horizon glows faintly, but the sky is empty. Below deck, pilots sit in silence beside their Zero fighters, helmets resting on their knees. Some whisper prayers, others stare at photographs tucked into their flight suits. None of them know they are moments away from meeting the most relentless air assault in naval history. Far beyond their sight, over 500 miles away, Task Force 58 prepares for launch. 14 American carriers align across the sea, decks trembling as engines roar awake. Hellcats, Avengers, dauntless dive bombers, wave after wave, fueled, armed, and waiting. Admiral Mitcher leans over the chart table, nodding once. The first catapult fires. A streak of flame tears through the morning haze. For the next 24 hours, the sky will belong to the Americans, and the Japanese Navy will witness the death of its carrier power, one sortie at a time. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered its turning point. The once invincible Japanese Navy, the same force that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor, was now in retreat, bleeding from every front. One island after another had fallen. American submarines prowled Japan's supply lines, and in the air, the U.S. Navy's growing armada of carriers ruled the ocean with industrial precision. Japan's high command knew what was coming next. The United States had targeted the Marianas Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, a vital triangle linking Japan to its southern empire. If the Marianas fell, American B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo itself. For Japan, that was unthinkable. So, the Imperial Navy formed a desperate plan, Operation Go, a massive, all-or-nothing counterattack to crush the American invasion fleet and reclaim the Central Pacific. The plan was bold, even brilliant on paper. The newly formed First Mobile Fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, was the pride of what remained of Japan's naval air power. 9 carriers, 5 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. Ozawa's idea was to lure the U.S. carriers into range of Japanese land-based airfields in the Marianas. Hundreds of planes from Guam, Tinian, and Rota would join carrier-based squadrons to overwhelm the Americans in one decisive blow. But this plan was built on an illusion, the illusion that Japan still possessed the pilots, coordination, and fuel to match the United States. Since Midway, 2 years earlier, Japan had lost the heart of its elite naval aviators. Most of the veterans who once led the Pacific's great strikes were gone, replaced by young, barely trained recruits with fewer than 100 hours of flight time. By contrast, the Americans had grown stronger, faster, and more disciplined. In 1942, they had fought for survival. By 1944, they fought with systemized precision, radar-directed, well-fed, and endlessly supplied from a war industry that never slept. As Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher advanced toward the Marianas, their combined fleet, Task Force 58, was a floating city of steel and firepower. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and over 400 aircraft in constant readiness. Each pilot was trained through a standardized program, each plane supported by radar-controlled fighter direction centers, each carrier capable of launching hundreds of sorties per day. Yet Spruance was cautious. His orders were simple: protect the invasion fleet landing on Saipan. Do not be drawn into a trap. Mitcher, commanding the carriers, wanted aggression. He believed in striking first, fast, and continuously until the enemy broke. In Tokyo, naval staff officers studied American movements and concluded the time had come. The decisive battle that Japan had dreamed of since the 1930s, the battle that would defend the Emperor's empire, would now be fought in the skies above the Philippine Sea. What they didn't realize was that the Americans had already learned every trick Japan planned to use. They had the advantage of radar, aerial reconnaissance, and broken codes. They could see the Japanese before the Japanese could see them, and so, as the sun rose over the Marianas on June 19, 1944, Japan's dream of victory sailed into a storm it would never escape. The American invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944. By the third day, over 60,000 U.S. Marines and soldiers had established a firm beachhead. From his flagship Taya, Admiral Ozawa believed this was his moment to strike. His fleet, spread across 500 miles of ocean, began moving east, intending to surprise Task Force 58 in a single devastating blow. But the U.S. Navy wasn't blind. Its radar network stretched across the sky like an invisible web, and submarines patrolling the Philippine Sea had already detected the movement of the Japanese fleet. Messages flashed through Mitcher's task groups. The enemy was coming. While Ozawa's carriers carried about 430 planes, only a fraction were piloted by veterans. Many of his flyers had never even landed on a carrier deck before. In contrast, the Americans fielded over 900 carrier aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers, flown by men who had survived Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomon. Their training was uniform, their communication clear, and above all, they trusted their radar. Radar, that invisible guardian, had transformed the very nature of naval warfare. The Americans could now detect incoming raids hundreds of miles away, vectoring their fighters to intercept long before the Japanese could even see the fleet. For the Imperial Navy, this was a nightmare. Their strategy was built on surprise and aggressive offense. Radar erased both. Meanwhile, Admiral Spruance weighed every report carefully. His instincts were methodical, almost clinical. He refused to rush into Ozawa's trap. To some of his subordinates, he appeared too cautious, even hesitant. But Spruance understood the broader picture. His mission was not to chase glory, but to protect the amphibious landing. Losing the transports meant losing the Marianas, and losing the Marianas meant prolonging the war. On June 18th, the seas were calm, the air heavy with anticipation. U.S. carrier decks buzzed with activity, aircraft lined in perfect order. Crews checking fuel lines, loading bombs, calibrating guns. Pilots briefed in crowded ready rooms, tracing lines on maps, memorizing radio code. Mitcher gave his simple, sharp instruction: we'll hit them before they hit us. Across the horizon, Ozawa's fleet advanced blindly into the trap. His carriers, Tei, Shirkaku, Zukaku, and others, formed what Japan still believed to be the most powerful striking force on Earth. Yet beneath the surface, unseen and unheard, American submarines stalked them. At 8 a.m. on June 19th, as the first Japanese aircraft took off to attack, the submarine USS Albacore found its target. A torpedo streaked toward Tei, Ozawa's brand new flagship. Moments later, a thunderous explosion. Fumes filled the hangar decks. The ship survived, but barely. Within hours, leaking aviation fuel ignited. The pride of Japan's Navy turned into a floating inferno. To the American, it was only the beginning. Radar screens soon lit up with hundreds of incoming blips. The first wave of Japan's decisive air assault. Mitcher's voice cut through the carrier intercom. All fighters, intercept. The largest carrier battle in history was about to begin. And before the sun would set, the skies above the Philippine Sea would witness one of the most one-sided aerial massacres ever recorded. Angle 1, the human side. Young men in an old war, they called them one-way pilots, though they weren't supposed to be. Most of the Japanese aviators who lifted off that morning had never fired their guns in real combat. Some were barely 20 years old. They carried on their shoulders the ghost of a legend, the myth of the invincible Zero, the spirit of Pearl Harbor, the shadow of Midway's dead. In the ready rooms of the carrier Shirkaku, commanders still spoke in slogans: loyalty, honor, sacrifice, but beneath those words lay exhaustion. Aviation fuel was scarce. Maintenance crews were working with improvised parts, and pilots were rushed through training fields that could no longer afford real airplanes. Many learned on wooden mock-ups before being sent into the sky. When they took off from their carriers, they believed they were flying toward destiny. What awaited them was radar-guided precision fire and American pilots who had flown hundreds of combat hours. For every Japanese aviator who climbed into a cockpit, the sky that morning was already a grave. Meanwhile, aboard U.S. carriers, the mood was steady, almost routine. Hellcat pilots joked in the ready rooms, drank coffee, studied maps, and followed checklists down to the smallest detail. They didn't rely on heroics, they relied on systems. Their confidence didn't come from arrogance, but from training that had turned chaos into procedure. When the order came, launch the cap, they moved as one. No glory speeches, just professionalism forged by repetition. Asterisk. Two worlds were about to collide, one bound by faith and tradition, the other by structure and technology. And in that clash, the Japanese human spirit would meet the mechanical efficiency of American modern warfare. Angle 2, the tactical dimension, radar and the new eyes of war. Battle of the Philippine Sea wasn't decided by luck or courage, it was decided by information. Radar, still a new and imperfect tool in 1942, had matured into a weapon by 1944. The Americans possessed ship-mounted radar sets that could track incoming aircraft more than 150 miles away every time a Japanese wave appeared on the screen. Fighter directors aboard carriers like Lexington and Enterprise issued surgical commands to intercept. The U.S. Navy called it controlled chaos. Every American carrier had a combat information center, a dark, crowded room filled with glowing screens, maps, and headsets. From there, officers directed Hellcat squadrons into the perfect altitude, bearing, and timing to meet incoming raids. For the Japanese, the first sign of danger came when tracer rounds ripped through their formations. By contrast, Ozawa's fleet had no such coordination. Japanese ships lacked radar strong enough to detect enemy aircraft at range, and radio discipline was poor. Pilots often launched into open water without precise positions of the enemy. They flew for hours, relying on outdated coordinates, until fuel ran low, then turned back to carriers that were already sinking or aflame. The result was tragic efficiency. American pilots didn't need to find the enemy. The enemy came straight to them. Hellcats tore through the Japanese formations in wave after wave. Their 6.50 caliber machine guns shredded Zero fighters and Judy dive bombers before they could even approach. For every American aircraft lost, nearly 10 Japanese planes fell from the sky. The once dominant art of Japanese aerial warfare. Tight turns, sudden climbs, elegant dogfights was crushed by radar vectors and brute firepower. The term turkey shoot wasn't mockery. It was disbelief. Veteran U.S. pilots couldn't believe how easy it had become. But behind that ease lay years of painful learning. The lessons of Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal, finally repaid with overwhelming mastery. Angle 3, the technological edge. Industry in the sky in 1941. Japan had the superior aircraft. By 1944, the advantage had shifted entirely. The American F-6F Hellcat was not as elegant as the Zero, but it was faster, tougher, and deadlier. It could climb higher, dive faster, and absorb hits that would tear a Zero apart. Its design reflected America's philosophy of war: durability over delicacy, production over perfection. Behind every Hellcat was an industrial army. Factories in New Jersey and California produced hundreds each month. Spare parts were standardized, logistics seamless, and training manuals identical across squadrons. If one pilot fell, another was ready within weeks. Japan, by contrast, could barely replace its losses. Factories were bombed, materials scarce, and oil shipments strangled by U.S. submarines. Technology wasn't just the machines. It was the process. American carriers functioned like assembly lines at sea. Bombs loaded, planes fueled, pilots briefed, launches timed to the second. On some carriers, aircraft were taking off every 45 seconds. The decks alive with motion and discipline. It was industrial warfare in its purest form. A mechanical heartbeat stretching across the ocean. And for Japan, that hum of engines and hydraulics spelled doom. Because no matter how skilled a handful of pilots might be, no nation could fight forever against a factory that floated. Angle 4, leadership. Ozawa versus Mitchell. Leadership often decides the rhythm of war. On one side of the Philippine Sea stood Vice Admiral Gisibor Ozawa, the last of Japan's great carrier commanders, calm, composed, and loyal to the end. He believed in his fleet, though he knew it was hollowed by years of attrition. His carriers looked strong on paper, but beneath the decks, fuel shortages and inexperienced crews had already doomed them. Still, he pressed forward. Honor demanded it. Facing him was Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitchell, commander of Task Force 58, a quiet, practical man who led not by speeches but by trust. He had built an organization so efficient that the carriers operated like a single organism. Mitchell rarely raised his voice. His command came through method and calm, not charisma. His loyalty was to his men and to precision itself. The contrast could not be sharper. Ozawa led through faith in the emperor, in tradition, in destiny. Mitchell led through systems, radar, coordination, logistics. Both were men of conviction that the battlefield had changed. The future no longer belonged to intuition or spirit. It belonged to data, structure, and endurance. When the first reports arrived that morning, hundreds of Japanese planes inbound, Mitchell didn't panic. He merely nodded and said, "We'll take care of them." It wasn't arrogant. It was mathematics. He knew the numbers, the readiness, and the distance. Ozawa, on the other hand, received no such clarity. Radio silence, static, and confusion filled his command room. His pilots vanished into the blue and never returned. The battle was not just between admirals. It was between two worlds, the old one fading into myth, and the new one powered by the machine age. Angle 5, the enemy perspective. Chaos and disbelief from the bridge of the carrier Zuikaku. Japanese officers could see their fighters vanish into the horizon, dozens at a time, until the skies were empty. Hours passed. Then, one by one, crippled planes limped back, riddled with bullets, leaking fuel, sometimes landing on the wrong decks or crashing into the sea beside them. Reports trickled in, lost contact, no visual, engaged, all destroyed. At first, the officers refused to believe it. How could their elite airmen be wiped out so easily? They had trained for years, taught that courage and surprise would win any fight. But the Americans had rewritten the rules. They fought not as individual pilots, but as a system, radar-guided, data-driven, supported by fleets of ships that never slept. Soon the decks filled with the wreckage of returning planes. Flames licked the edges of the flight decks as damaged aircraft crashed during landing. The smell of burning oil filled the air. Below deck, mechanics and medics worked in suffocating smoke to save what little remained. Officers shouted orders through gas masks. Sailors dumped burning planes overboard. But it was no use. The Japanese fleet wasn't losing a battle, it was watching its doctrine collapse in real time. The idea that a handful of skilled pilots could dominate through spirit and courage was dying in front of them. By sunset, Ozawa's staff finally faced reality. Half their planes were gone. The enemy fleet, still unseen, had not even begun its main assault. For many Japanese sailors, this was the first time they realized the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. Angle 6, the psychological shock. The end of an elusive warfare is more than destruction. it is disillusionment. For the Japanese Navy, this battle shattered an identity built on decades of triumph. Since the Russo-Japanese War, their sailors had believed themselves unmatched at sea. Pearl Harbor had seemed to confirm it. Now, and one day, that confidence evaporated. American strikes didn't come once, they came in waves. When the first was over, the second arrived. When the second ended, a third followed, refueled, rearmed. Coordinated by rotating carrier decks, the U.S. Navy fought as if fatigue no longer existed. To Japanese eyes, it seemed inhuman. Planes appeared from every direction, never stopping, never hesitating. Survivors of the first air engagements later recalled feeling hunted by a machine that did not sleep. The sea that had once given them power now reflected fire, the burning carrier, the dying planes, the endless horizon that offered no escape. Some whispered it was divine punishment. Others said it was simply the future catching up. By the end of June 19, the Japanese command realized they were not facing just another battle, they were witnessing the end of their era and the birth of an American one. The next day would only confirm it. June 19, 1944, the day of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. At 10 a.m., the first Japanese formations appeared on the radar screens of Task Force 58 for separate waves, totaling more than 350 aircraft, all converging toward the American fleet. Inside the Combat Information Center, comm voices relayed coordinates: bearing 320 degrees, range 150 miles, altitude 18,000 feet. Fighter directors began vectoring squadrons. In minutes, over 200 Hellcats lifted from the carriers, climbing through layered clouds like a swarm of metal hawks. The sky above the Philippine Sea turned into a vast killing ground. Hellcat dove through the enemy formations in disciplined silence. Tracer fire lit the air, red and white streaks cutting across sunlight. Within moments, the first Japanese bombers exploded midair, their fuel tanks igniting in orange bursts. Those who broke through met an even deadlier wall: U.S. anti-aircraft fire from battleships and cruisers below, guided by radar and computer-assisted guns. From the bridge of Lexington, observers watched the spectacle unfold. One officer later wrote, "It was as if the entire horizon was raining airplanes. For every American plane lost, nearly 10 Japanese aircraft fell into the sea. The ocean became a graveyard of black smoke and drifting debris. By noon, the first wave was gone. The second followed. Another 100 planes, launched from Zukaku and Hiyu. They met the same fate. Radar picked them up at extreme range, and Hellcats tore them apart before they could even see the U.S. fleet. Only a handful reached bombing distance. None scored a direct hit. The coordination, discipline, and radar integration of Task Force 58 worked flawlessly. The Japanese, by contrast, fought blind. American pilots would later describe the battle not with pride, but with disbelief. They had trained for the fight of their lives, yet found themselves shooting down enemies who barely fought back. The veteran Japanese airmen of 1942 were gone. What remained were boys flying into death guided by obsolete doctrine. Below deck, in the American hangars, mechanics refueled and rearmed aircraft with mechanical rhythm. As soon as one squadron landed, another launched. The decks never rested. In one afternoon, Task Force 58 launched and recovered more than 400 sorties, an industrial rhythm at sea. By evening, the reports were almost monotonous. Enemy formation destroyed, 30 shot down, no losses. Returning to base, on carrier bridges, the officers spoke quietly, almost somberly. They understood what was happening. They were not just winning a battle, they were erasing Japan's naval air arm from existence. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Admiral Ozawa waited for word. His radar, primitive and unreliable, gave him nothing. Communications from the first strike groups fell silent. At 4 p.m., a few crippled aircraft returned, landing with shattered landing gear or missing wings. Most never came back. By sunset, the Imperial Navy had lost over 150 aircraft in a single day, the majority of its veteran pilots gone forever. Ozawa's fleet still floated, but its eyes and fist had been torn away. His only choice now was to hold the line through the night, hoping for a chance to strike back. But the Americans were not finished. Mitcher's carriers were already preparing for the night, refueling, reloading, and briefing new squadrons. For the first time in naval history, the U.S. would attempt a night carrier strike on a scale never seen before. The 24-hour onslaught was only halfway done. As darkness fell over the Philippine Sea, the battle refused to end. Smoke from burning aircraft drifted low across the horizon, glowing faintly under a blood-red sunset. On the decks of Task Force 58, floodlights illuminated rows of aircraft being refueled and armed again. Admiral Mitcher studied the radar plots. His operators reported dozens of Japanese ships retreating west, some damaged, others barely moving. He knew this was the chance to finish what the daylight strikes had begun. But there was risk. The fleet was still 250 miles from the enemy. Launching at night meant pilots might have to land in total darkness. On heaving decks. MITSCHER paused for a long moment, then said quietly, "Launch him." At 7 p.m., Engines roared again across the carriers. Avengers, Helldivers, and Hellcats took off into the fading light, forming dark silhouettes against the red sky. Below deck, crews worked by torchlight, sweating and shouting over the thunder of catapults. It was the first large-scale night carrier strike in history, a gamble that would define the outcome of the Pacific Air War. The Japanese fleet, battered and half-blind, had no radar warning when the first wave of American bombers found them. It was like a storm descending from nowhere, from the carrier Hiyu. Sailors looked up to see black shapes diving out of the clouds, releasing bombs that vanished into the decks. Seconds later, explosions tore through the ship. Flames engulfed the hangars. Hiyu rolled, burning, and sank within the hour. Elsewhere, torpedo bombers targeted the crippled Shirkaku, once the pride of Pearl Harbor's strike force. At 8:30 p.m., a torpedo from USS Kavala ripped through her side, igniting fuel tanks. The ship exploded so violently that debris rained down miles away. To the Americans, these were names they had heard for years, now erased from the sea in a single night. For the Japanese, the experience was apocalyptic, radarless, and disorganized. They could not see their attackers or even coordinate defense. Searchlights stabbed uselessly into the clouds. Gunners fired blind into darkness. Some ships fired at their own planes, mistaking them for enemies. The ocean echoed with confusion, shouted orders, gunfire, and the scream of engines fading into blackness. Meanwhile, on the American side, returning pilots faced their own terror. They had been flying for hours, low on fuel, the horizon invisible. When they finally reached their carriers, the decks were pitch black to avoid enemy detection. Dozens of pilots circled above, nearly out of gas. One by one, voices crackled over the radio, running dry. "Can't find you." Mitcher made a fateful decision. He ordered, "Turn on the lights." Instantly, every carrier switched on floodlights, deck lamps, and even searchlights, a beacon across the dark ocean. It was a massive risk. The fleet became visible to any enemy submarine or plane still lurking nearby, but it saved lives. One by one, exhausted pilots found the glow and landed on illuminated decks. Some crashed, some ran out of fuel and ditched beside their ships, but hundreds made it home. On the bridge, Mitcher stood silent, watching the flickering lights across the sea, each one a symbol of victory and survival. By dawn, the outcome was undeniable. Japan had lost 3 carriers, over 400 aircraft, and the majority of its remaining veteran pilots. The Americans had lost fewer than 30 planes. Combat. The imbalance was so vast that even Mitcher's officers struggled to believe the reports. For the Imperial Navy, the battle was more than a defeat. It was the death of its carrier arm. From that night onward, Japan would never again mount a coordinated carrier offensive. The once proud fleet that had begun the Pacific War in triumph now drifted westward, crippled and blind, into silence. The Philippine Sea belonged to the United States. The morning after the battle, the Philippine Sea was eerily calm. The smoke had thinned, and the sun rose over an ocean littered with the wreckage of Japan's lost air arm. Oil slicks, drifting life rafts, fragments of fuselage glinting on the waves. Here and there, American destroyers cruised slowly, searching for survivors. The scale of destruction was hard to comprehend. In less than 24 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered its greatest defeat since Midway, and this time, the loss was irreversible. 3 of its major carriers, Tei, Shirkaku, and Hiyu, had been sunk. More than 400 aircraft were destroyed, and with them, the last generation of Japan's skilled naval aviators. The figures told one story. The faces told another. For the first time since the war began, Japan no longer had the men to fly the planes it could still build. Admiral Ozawa survived, rescued from the sea after Tei exploded. When he was pulled aboard a cruiser, he asked only one question: how many planes remain? The answer came in a whisper: "Few, Admiral, very few." He bowed his head. The dream of decisive victory, the very soul of Japan's naval tradition, was gone. On the American side, the victory was greeted not with celebration, but with quiet awe. In ready rooms, pilots dozed in their flight suits, too tired to speak. Mechanics lay on hangar decks, surrounded by the smell of fuel and sweat. The phrase "the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot" began as a joke among the pilots, a moment of disbelief that so many enemy planes could fall so easily. But even they knew the deeper truth. The Japanese Navy had fought bravely, but it had been sent to die. In Washington, the news electrified military planners. The road to Japan had opened. The Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam were now secured as forward bases for the B-29 Superfortress, the long-range bomber capable of reaching Tokyo itself. For the first time, American airmen could strike the Japanese homeland directly. The Philippine Sea had not just been a naval victory, it had changed the geometry of the war. Meanwhile, Japanese morale collapsed. Tokyo radio announced the loss only vaguely, claiming some ships were damaged and a number of aircraft were lost. But within the naval staff, the truth spread quickly. The once proud carriers that had symbolized Japan's rise as a world power were gone, officers who had once boasted of invincibility now spoke in whispers. Younger cadets were told to prepare for special attacks, the early seeds of what would later become the kamikaze strategy for the U.S. Navy. The scale of the triumph was not just in the numbers. It was proof that modern warfare, radar, logistics, industrial power, and methodical training had replaced the romanticism of old battleships and dueling aces. The carrier had proven itself to be the true king of the Pacific. And America, with its endless capacity to build and replenish, now ruled that kingdom absolutely. The sun set again over calm water that evening, but for Japan, the light would never rise the same way again. In Tokyo, the reaction to the Philippine Sea disaster was muted, almost ceremonial. Official communiques spoke of a fierce engagement and gallant efforts, but within the Imperial General Headquarters, despair settled like dust on old maps. Japan's naval aviation, once the pride of the empire, no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Factories could still assemble Zero fighters and bombers, but there were no longer pilots capable of flying them into battle. The loss of Tay struck hardest. It had been Japan's most advanced carrier, heavily armored, equipped with modern elevators, and symbolically tied to the dream of rebirth after Midway. Its destruction on its first combat mission was a psychological wound the Navy never recovered from. Admiral Ozawa's report to the Emperor was restrained and painfully honest. Our air strength is lost. We can no longer contest the enemy in the air. It was the first acknowledgement from a Japanese admiral that the carrier era, the heart of Japan's naval doctrine, was over for the American. The victory was not only a matter of dominance but of momentum. From the Marianas, fleet surged forward without pause. Guam was liberated, Tinian captured, and airfields began to fill with the massive silhouettes of B-29 superfortresses. Within months, those bombers would begin striking the Japanese home island, culminating in the firebombing of Tokyo and the atomic destruction of Hiroshima. Nagasaki, the Philippine Sea had been the hinge on which the Pacific War turned from attrition to annihilation. The defeat also reshaped Japanese strategy, with no experienced pilots left to fight the Americans head-on. The Imperial Navy turned to desperation. By late 1944, commanders began organizing special attack units, suicide pilots, who would crash their planes directly into enemy ships. What began as improvisation became doctrine. The kamikaze was born not from fanaticism alone, but from a void, the absence of any other option for the United States. The battle validated a new kind of warfare. It proved that training, coordination, and technology could outmatch courage and tradition. It confirmed that naval air power, powered by industry and logistics, was the modern sword of empire. And it marked Admiral Spruance and Mitcher as the architects of a new form of sea control. Domination through endurance. The numbers told a brutal truth. Japan lost over 3 carriers, 2 oilers, and 430 aircraft. The U.S. lost 123 aircraft, most of them to fuel exhaustion or accidents, not combat. The ratio, nearly 10-1, was so vast that it seemed abstract, but every digit represented the collapse of a century-old dream. The idea that Japan could rule the Pacific through spirit and precision alone. By early July, the Imperial Navy retreated toward Okinawa to regroup, but it would never again sail as a major carrier force. The survivors of the battle, sailors, pilots, and commanders, carried home not just defeat but disbelief. They had entered the Philippine Sea expecting to avenge Midway. They left it witnessing the end of their own age. The ocean that once shimmered under the rising sun now reflected only wreckage and silence. For the men who lived through it, that silence would never leave them. It was the sound of an empire breaking, quietly, completely, forever. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not just a victory, it was a transformation. In 24 hours of relentless assault, the balance of the Pacific shifted irreversibly. The myth of Japan's aerial supremacy, built at Pearl Harbor, glorified at Coral Sea, and defended at Midway, ended here. Amid smoke and silence on a calm blue sea. From that day forward, the ocean itself belonged to the machine. No longer would wars at sea be decided by courage alone, or by the instincts of a few gifted pilots. They would be decided by systems, by radar screens, fuel lines, assembly plants, and the invisible math of logistics. The American carrier groups became something beyond human scale, floating factories of destruction, driven by discipline, maintained by endless supply, and coordinated through information. For the men who fought it, the memory of that day remained haunting. American pilots, hardened by combat, admitted that the sight of Japanese planes falling by the hundreds left them uneasy. Victory had never felt so mechanical. And for the Japanese survivors, there was no heroism left to cling to, only the heavy truth that the age of the warrior had been overtaken by the age of the engineer. Yet within that shift lies the essence of modern war. The Philippine Sea marked the end of romantic warfare and the beginning of industrial precision, a new world where endurance, data, and machinery defined power. In that sense, it was more than a battle. It was a prophecy. It foretold the wars of the future, where victory would belong not to those who dreamed bravely, but to those who built relentlessly. When dawn returned to the Pacific on June 20, 1944, the sun rose over wreckage, twisted metal, drifting fuel, and the quiet of thousands gone. But it also rose over a new reality. The Japanese Empire had reached its horizon, and across that same sea, the United States sailed forward, methodical, unbroken, unstoppable. From that morning on, the Pacific would never again echo with the sound of Japan's carriers, only the hum of American engines, rising endlessly toward the future.